Hello and welcome to the NOC course on symbolic logic. We are going to do this for 20 hours. So, today we are starting with the module 1. Module 1, I introduce you to what logic is, and then I will define it as a study of reasoning, and then we will go into talk about what reasoning is, what is its link with logic, what are the basic kinds of logic, and then this distinction between Western and Indian logic. So, this is the plan that we will follow in this module. A simple definition of logic is that it is a systematic study of reasoning. I must tell you that though the name of the course is symbolic logic, but this beginning classes, some few lectures that we will hold, maybe 4 or 5, we are going to do it rather informally without use of any symbols, so that an introductory or a beginning student can understand it better. So, we are going to switch to symbols from perhaps after 6th or 7th lecture, but let us start with where we were, namely that logic is a study. First of all, that it is a discipline, and that it is a systematic kind of a study, which means there are principles and that it is organized, but the content of logic, if you ask what this logic is a study about or on, then we have to say it is about reasoning. Sometimes it is called an art of reasoning. I hope you know the difference between art and science, but the art requires some sort of skill. So, when we are talking about logic as an art of reasoning, we are talking about that there are skills to learn, that there are ways to think about how to do reasoning best, and so on and so forth. Now, sometimes it is also called the science of reasoning. So, when we want to talk about a science, we mean that there is a systematic body of knowledge here, and that there are also principles behind that. Now, in case of logic, these principles would be the principles of correct reasoning. The moment I say that, it should flag you that there are also incorrect ways of reasoning. What logic will try to teach you is the ways of correct reasoning, and there are justifications and principles which will guide us how to make reasoning correctly. So, what I have done is to define it in a rather simple way, that first of all, logic is a systematic study of reasoning. I have also told you what the topic or the content of logic is, namely about reasoning. And there are two kinds of approaches to logic that you can think about as a skill development, which is also good, but you can also think about as a basic science, which speaks about formalizing, which speaks about organizing the area or the studies with some very fundamental principles. But first, let us talk about what reasoning is. We have used the word reasoning, but I am yet to sort of come to a clearer definition about it. So, let us see what is reasoning. See, we learn in many different ways. We learn through our senses. We have 5 senses, the eyes, the ears, the skin, and so on. But then there is also another way to learn or gather knowledge, and that is reasoning. Why do we need reasoning? The answer is quite clear, because the world is such that always complete information is not available to us. And when that happens, what we do is that we fill up those gaps where information is not available with a different kind of cognitive process. And that is where you will find what reasoning is. Let me give you an example to explain this. For example, suppose you come to IIT Kharagpur and you come to meet me, and instead of seeing me, you find that there is a lock on my door. What do your eyes see? The answer is you see a lock. But if I ask you what do you know, your answer is going to be quite different. You will say that I know that you are not in there. Would you wait for me? Probably not. Now, let us change the scenario a little bit. Suppose again you come to meet me, but this time you see a latch on my door. Again, your eyes pick up the information that there is a latch on my door. But if I ask you what you know, the answer is not that there is a latch on my door. The answer is much more than that. What you know is probably I am somewhere. Would you wait for me? The answer is yes. So, the knowledge affects the kind of behavior that you do, but please note that the knowledge is not a clearly given knowledge. So, it is not a direct knowledge that you have obtained. You saw something, but you know something, and that gap between what you saw and what you know, that gap has been filled up by this process, cognitive process that we call reasoning. So, acts of reasoning are to be found in this kind of gaps, and these are very interesting kinds of acts. So, this is what we will call reasoning. Now, human reasoning is a very basic kind of cognitive activity. We, throughout our lives and also through generations, if you believe in evolution, then biologically we can show that we acquire knowledge, we have been acquiring knowledge through reasoning for eons. It is a mental process that keeps on going. You look at all the sensory input and then you add something more to gain more knowledge out of the situation. So, in a way, reasoning, first of all, please note that it is a mental process. It happens somewhere in your mind. What it does, it enables you to go beyond what is given through your sensory inputs, and that is a very important activity. Otherwise, we would be limited, very limited in our knowledge. We can show you many situations where you are making quick decisions based on reasoning. For example, think about crossing a very, very busy intersection. Your eyes are picking up fast moving cars, the images of them, your ears are picking up the sound signals, but mentally what you are doing is very quick reasoning, calculation of where to go, how to cross the street without getting hurt. Now, this is a very complex reasoning example, but there can be very simpler also. But in what I am trying to tell you is that reasoning is a very fundamental kind of cognitive activity, and it actually shows up in other forms of cognitive activity. For example, when you are understanding something, what you are reading are words, but then from that you are making meaning, and that meaning making has to be done on the basis of reasoning. Similarly, social responses, you see somebody sitting or you see somebody waving at you, and then what is the appropriate social response? You are quickly going through the reasoning to get that appropriate responses out. And the most manifested probably example of reasoning application would be problem solving, but we will come to that later on. So, I am trying to show you, when I said that the subject matter of logic is reasoning, this is your acquaintance with the process that logic sort of tries to understand, tries to formalize, tries to talk about correct ways of doing, and that is a very fundamental kind of cognitive activity. So, I will repeat what I have said earlier, that logic in a way is both an art of reasoning, how to do this reasoning in a better sort of a way, and it is also a science of reasoning in the sense that there is a normative angle mainly telling us how to do it correctly, how to do it not just better, but how to do it properly. So, there are two ways to look at logic. Now, that was our quick introduction to the content of logic, but let us come to the study itself. Now, I always thought that one way to learn about things is to go to what we say is etymology. Etymology means where the root of the word is, and if you look at the root of the word logic, then it is in a Greek word called logos. You may have heard this term logos earlier. It has come from Greek language. Logos has many meanings, actually, many meanings in Greek, and there are various kind of applications, but we will follow what Aristotle used it as. Aristotle used logos to mean some sort of a reasoned discourse. So, it is a body of knowledge that is not haphazard, and it is guided by reasoning. So, in that sense, we will try to remember this word logos. And then I have told you, since etymology sort of gives you a hint what the study is like, since logic is derived from the word logos, it is also a reasoned discourse. But what is the content of this? I have told you that it is reasoning, but Let us try this. See, wherever we see this term logos as in logic, you get to see a reference to a study. For example, you may have heard about these disciplines: biology, sociology, geology, and I would like to point to the presence of logos in this. Where? Here. This is logy. The logy comes from the Greek word logos. So, here is logos of bio, this is logos of socio, this is logos of geo, and so on. What happens is that there is a prefix to the logos, and that tells us what the logos is about or the reason discourse is about. For example, here the prefix is bio, which means that it is a reason discourse about the living or the sphere of life, bios. This is about society, this is about geo or earth. In comparison, when we look into logic, there is no reference to the subject domain, there is no prefix, just logos derived word logic, and there is no indication about which area this is going to cover. This is there is a cue in that or clue in that. The absence of the prefix in a way sort of tells us that it is a topic neutral study. What Gilbert Ryle, a philosopher, said, it is a topic neutral study. It means that it does not matter where you are applying logic, it will be a tool. This is the reason why often, like mathematics, logic is called universal tool. No matter which subject domain you are applying it to, it will give you some help. So, in a way, what we have just found out is that, first of all, being a kind of a logos, logic is a reason discourse. But what is its content? It is reasoning. Please note that we are trying to understand reasoning, and we are making a discourse based on reasoning, and we have to use as a tool also our reasoning. So, there is a self-referential sort of a loop in logic, which is unavoidable, because that is the only way to do it, but that is what the nature of this study is. So, in a way it is kind of rather abstract, but at the same time it is immensely applicable in no matter what kind of study that you are looking into. Now, I have said so far that this is logic teaches us reason or guides us in reasoning and so on, but still let us make this question very clear. If you now ask me, then what is the role of logic in reasoning? Does it actually teach us how to reason? I have to tell you then, no, it does not, because that is what you have already are equipped with. Your brain has equipped you, your survival so far has equipped you how to reason, otherwise you would not be surviving so far. So, in order to survive in life, you do not have to sit in a class of logic. Before that, you already know how to reason. Then what is it that logic does? What it does is to teach you how to do that reasoning correctly. See, as I told you, there are more than one ways to do reasoning. You can do reasoning, because remember, reasoning is always a jump. There is a gap between what you actually get the information on and what you are trying to infer from it, or what you are trying to know from it. So, there is a gap, and because of the precarious or dangerous nature of this gap, there is chances that you might go awry, you might go into a wrong way. So, what logic does as a systematic study is to sort of guide you how to do this reasoning correctly, and in a way it gives you criteria how to differentiate good reasoning from bad reasoning. So, it is not a matter of opinion that you call some certain kinds of reasoning good and certain kinds of reasoning bad. There are ways to justify those, and those are the principles that we are going to learn. So, this is the role that logic plays. Broadly, logic can be of two types, what we call formal logic and what we call informal logic. In other contexts, I also teach informal logic, but this is not a class on informal logic, but let me just acquaint you, at least give you an idea what informal logic does. See, always the questions of logic or where you can apply logic doesn't come always neatly in mathematical terms or in quantity terms or in symbolic terms, where you can formalize and apply this kind of logic. But often in real life situations, there are questions to be answered, and those are logical puzzles. So in a way, there you're going to get help from informal logic, because it teaches that how to reason well in real life situations, how to apply critical thinking. This is an important sort of a skill that informal logic teaches on. On the other hand, formal logic is something else. So we are going to do more of formal logic, and we are not going to touch on informal logic in this course. So this is what logic is according to formal logic, that there is going to be typically 3 components in it: the syntax, the semantics, and a deductive system or a proof theory. So these are the basic components that a formal logic will have, and we are going to go through these components when we start the symbolic logic properly. In this course, as I said, we are going to only look into formal logic, and that too the Western logic. When I say Western logic, you might seem surprised that why I mentioned Western logic. The reason I say this is because India has also a rich tradition of logic that we call Indian logic. Unfortunately, we will not have a course on that, but let me just at least give you an overview that what I am talking about. See, Indian logic, when we talk about, there are ancient logic texts available from, say, 6th century BCE. And there were 2 kinds of major schools of logic. One was called Anvikshiki and the other was called Tarka. And the goals of these 2 schools were quite different. Anvikshiki was for seeking out the truth. The Tarka was about debate, public debate skills. As you know, that in those days the scholars, the pandits would have a proper open public debate where they are supposed to argue with each other, and the winner was decided by the weight of the merit of the arguments and so on, and it carried a lot of rewards, it carried a lot of titles and so on. So in a way, the Tarka school was about the rhetoric, about the public speaking and so on. Anvikshiki was more of a more fundamental sort of an inquiry. And if you want to know who are the which schools are those, well, you can look into among the Hindu schools. There was Nyaya tradition, which is known for its logic. The Buddhist logic tradition is extremely strong and robust. The Jains also have a very different kind of a logic and a very interesting kind of logic system. The classical proponents name some of these names you may have heard. Nagarjuna, for example, Dingnaga, Vasubandhu, Gautama and so on. And when Nalanda was a university, people used to come and learn under these masters at Nalanda. So there are well-known texts of Indian logic, Nyaya Sutra, Vaisheshika Sutra, for example, and so on. And if you want, you can always read up on this, because there are some translated texts also available. There have been also newer developments in Indian logic. This is called Navya Nyaya, which means neo logic, neo kind of Indian logic, which has been quite popular in, for example, West Bengal side. It had its roots. It also went to Benares, and then I know personally a computational linguistics group or machine translation groups which have taken help from this kind of neo logic of Indian logic. But we are into formal logic, Western formal logic. So I'll end this module with this kind of a introduction, that there are many kinds of formal logical systems, many. And this is not to give you a proper or a complete picture, but this is just to show you that there are many kind of logics. First, that is something that you must go away from this course with, that there are different kinds of logics. Why? Because of necessity. Wherever we have needed to, and logics have been discovered or devised and so on. For example, there is this propositional logic, and there is first order predicate logic. There are sets and categorical logic, and these 3 actually constitute what we would call the classical standard logic, and this is what we will do in this course. But look at the other varieties that are there. Some of you may have heard about the fuzzy logic. The basic assumptions of fuzzy logic does not match with the standard classical logic. One example might settle your doubt that the standard logic sort of believe in only two kind of truth values, truth and falsity. Fuzzy logic does not. Fuzzy logic believes in that there are many more intervals in between. So, accordingly the logic changes. The necessity is such that there are different kinds of logic. This, for example, is temporal logic, which uses time as a factor. Suppose you want to talk about an operation that has to happen after something or before that. So, that kind of time references, doing logic with that time references is what you will find in the temporal logic. So, this is just to show you that there are various kinds of logics, but we will be concentrating only on, say, we will start with propositional logic and then we will move towards first order predicate logic, but would make a detour through categorical logic, which is nothing but a sort of brief introduction to Aristotelian kind of logic. So, with this is our introduction to this, and with that I will end the module number 1.